Welcome back to Chapter 4 of the Complete Web Developer course. Now you've covered HTML, CSS and JavaScript, which is really all you need to create great looking and interactive websites. But in this chapter we're going to delve a little bit further into a framework called jQuery. You can see the main website here. Essentially, jQuery is a JavaScript library which sits on top of JavaScript and allows you to access certain functions more easily and also gives you a bit more power, allowing you to create complex and interactive web apps more quickly. It's free to download, and I'll show you how to install it in the next video. But here we'll just take a few moments to see what sort of things you can do with jQuery. So here is the jQuery homepage. You can have a look at it and learn a little bit more about jQuery and how it works if you like. You can also download jQuery directly from here. We're also going to be spending a bit of time looking at what's known as the jQuery UI, which is a plugin on top of jQuery and allows you to do a lot of things very easily. Like if you want to create elements which drag around the page, you can do that. You can create elements which drop on top of others and then respond in some way. You can create lists which you can sort, etc., etc. So we're going to be spending a bit of time with that because it's a great way of easily adding interesting interactivity to your web apps. There are also a massive range of jQuery plugins available. I'm just going to show you a very small selection here. So pull to refresh is something that you'll likely be familiar with if you use a smartphone or a tablet. But this is very easy to use on the web as well. So you just install use hook, and when the user scroll down, then you can see a little refresh sort of thing pops up there, and you can use that to update your apps. Fantastic. Tooltipster is another one. Tooltips are little sort of mini pop-ups which appear and can be very useful to help users get to grips with your website or web app. If I hover over here, for example, got a nice tooltip there. That one requires a click. That one has different CSS, this one has links in it, etc., etc. You get the idea. So this is a free jQuery plugin which allows you to do more advanced tooltips than you can just by default. We've got Magnificent Pop-Up here. Despite the grand name, it's a very simple plugin which just allows you to do nice, easy pop-ups which look good and have things like galleries in them. So nice and easy. Unslider, very straightforward slider that you can use in your websites, very common. And the last one I'm going to show you is actually a Twitter-made jQuery plugin called Type Ahead, which you'll be very familiar with if you've used Google. You just type into the box and then it predicts what you might be interested in from a list that you might get from a database or might put in your code directly. So that's a very brief introduction to jQuery. In the next video, we're going to see how to install it, and then throughout the rest of this chapter, you'll find out how to use it to make interesting and interactive web apps. So the first thing to learn about jQuery is how to actually embed it in our web pages so that we can use it. So let's find out how to do that. I'm going to go back to my websites folder and create a new folder for my jQuery chapter. And then I'm going to load up the index.html file from the JavaScript chapter and just copy it over. So I've got something to work from. Let's get rid of that. So I'm just going to save as in the desktop, my websites, jQuery, and we'll keep it as index.html. Okay, just clean things up a little bit. Get rid of the content, and now we've just got a plain HTML file, and we'll change the title to Learning jQuery. Great. So hopefully you remember from the last chapter how to embed a JavaScript script file into a web page. I'll pause briefly for a moment for you to type that out for yourself. Give it a go. Okay, hopefully you typed something like script type equals text / JavaScript src equals something. We'll figure out what that is in a minute. And then close script. Okay. Now, there are two ways to embed jQuery into our pages. One of them is to link to jQuery. Now, there are two ways to embed jQuery in our web pages. One of them is to download jQuery from the jQuery website. Big orange button here, download jQuery. There are two major lines of jQuery, the 1.x line and the 2.x line. Generally, I'd recommend going for the 1.x line because that has further back support for Internet Explorer than the 2.x line. But as time goes on, we'll gradually move over from the 1.x line to the 2.x line. But they both work very similarly, so it really doesn't matter that much which one you choose. So you can download the latest version from here. Let's try that out. So we'll download the compressed production version. You only really need the uncompressed version if you actually want to look at the code of jQuery itself. If you don't, then downloading the compressed version is likely to be better for you because it will be faster. Okay, so there it is. That is jQuery, that code there. We're not going to go into how the code works or anything like that. We don't need that. All we need is how to install it on our system. So I'm going to save page as, and then go back to my desktop, my websites, jQuery. And you can see it's come up with a file name there. I'm going to simplify that a little bit and just call it jQuery.min.js. Save. And then all I need to do is type in here jQuery.min.js. And that's it. So now I have jQuery in that web page. The other way to do it that I mentioned is actually to link to the versions on jQuery's website or on Google's website. Google actually have a store for jQuery and various other JavaScript frameworks that you can link to directly if you like. I've got the URL saved in memory here, and that's what it is. So code.jquery.com at jQueryLatest.min.js. You can do it either way around. There are advantages and disadvantages. If you use your own piece of code, then obviously you're sure that you've got the version that you downloaded, whereas this version here will always get the latest version of jQuery. So if you want to be sure that you're using a specific version, then probably downloading it is a good idea. However, generally speaking, you're probably going to want to use the latest version, so this might work well for you. You don't have to manually download the new version when it's released. Another advantage of doing it this way is that the jQuery website will probably be slightly faster than yours, so the code will download slightly quicker. Also, it's likely that the user has been to other websites that use jQuery that might have already caused the user to download this jQuery file, and that means that it will already be on their machine, so they won't need to download it again. So that means that the loading of your site will be slightly faster than it would have been if they had to download jQuery from your website. So those are the choices, and really you can choose either one. We'll go for a local store for the moment, mostly because we're working offline here. I'm not actually, or I don't need to be connected to the internet if I've got a local version of the jQuery file. Right, now if I want to actually check that jQuery is installed, how do I do that? It hasn't actually had any impact on my page as yet. Well, let's get this page showing in Chrome and see what it actually looks like. we go. So at the moment it's a completely empty page because there's no content at all. Oops. Okay. So we can use a simple if command to work out whether or not jQuery is actually running. And there's a variable called jQuery. And that variable will only exist if jQuery is running. So let's just test that out. So if jQuery, alert, jQuery is installed. Brilliant, jQuery is installed. That's working. Fantastic. And just to make sure that that is in fact working, if I remove that script and refresh the page, we don't get that alert. So it is definitely recognizing that jQuery is installed. However, there is a problem with this script as it stands. If I want to actually have an option to do something if jQuery is not installed, so maybe I want to alert that fact, so jQuery is not installed. So if I now run that, I get jQuery is installed, because it is. If I remove that line, nothing happens. Now have a quick think. Why do you think that is? Why are we not getting the jQuery is not installed pop-up? Did you get it? Well, the problem is this jQuery variable only actually exists if jQuery is installed. So if jQuery is not installed, this variable doesn't exist, which means that the script will actually give an error and it won't run at all. So let's pop jQuery back in there for the moment. A nice way around that is to use the type of jQuery function. Sorry, it's a JavaScript function, not a jQuery function. So the type of function allows us to examine a variable and see what type it has, and the type of function will work even if that variable doesn't exist. So for example, I can say if type of jQuery is not equal to undefined. So that's just a way of using JavaScript to find out whether or not a variable is actually defined. So if jQuery is not undefined, then it must be installed. Let's see if that works. Great, it works. Now what happens if we now remove the jQuery from our code? We get the jQuery is not installed pop-up. Brilliant. So that's a very useful trick. If you want to find out if a variable actually is defined without breaking the code of your website, then use the type of variable and use a setup like this, saying if type of your variable is not equal to undefined, then your variable exists. Great. So we've got jQuery installed. Let's find out what we can do with it. I'm going to start by looking at how we can do all the things that we did before in JavaScript, but using jQuery. And we'll look at why jQuery might be advantageous in some ways. So first off, a little challenge for you. Can you create 2 red squares and 1 green circle? I'll give you a couple of moments. Did you manage it? Hopefully you did something like this. Created some style tags and a couple of divs. So I'll have, I said 1 green circle, I think. So we'll have an ID for our circle because there's only one of them. For our squares, we've got 2 of them. So I'm going to use class instead of ID. Okay. And then the styles for those will look something like this. So for our circle, we'll have a width of 200, a height of 200, a background color of green, and a border radius of 100 pixels. That should do our green circle. For our square, remember it's a class, so we use the dot rather than the hash. And we'll make them the same size. But they're going to have a background color of red and no border radius because we want them to be squares. Let's save that. Take a look. We've still got our JavaScript pop up there. Great. Okay, so I've got my circle and two squares. The squares have kind of merged into each other a little bit, so I'm going to give them a margin top of 10 pixels, just so it spreads out a little bit. There we go. Great. Okay, so we've got our circle and two squares. So all we're going to do in this video is use jQuery to set up a little script so that when we click on them, they pop up that they've been clicked on. So exactly the same as what we did with JavaScript. Let's see how we do it. We don't need this jQuery install script anymore, so I'm going to get rid of that. So the way we actually select an element in jQuery is a little bit different to how we do it in JavaScript. We use the string symbol, and that's the symbol that we use pretty much every time we use some jQuery. So it starts off a jQuery function. And in this case, we're going to select the ID of circle. So I'll write it out and then explain how we do that. So very simply, we've got the string symbol to invoke jQuery, and then we've got brackets, and inside those brackets, we've got a selector. So this selector selects the ID, because we're using the hash symbol, so it's an ID of circle. I'll show you a couple of different types of selectors in a minute, but for the moment we'll just carry on with this one. So we're selecting, using jQuery, the circle ID. So essentially we're selecting this green circle div up there. And we want to invoke the click function. So we use circle.click, and we want it to be a function, or the click is a function. And then the actual function that we want to run, we put inside those curly brackets. So it's a similar syntax to what we used with JavaScript. And in fact, it's worth saying a few times that jQuery is just JavaScript. It's just a layer on top of JavaScript to make it a little bit more usable. So we've got select our circle ID, and then when we click on it, we want to run this particular function, and then the function we're going to put inside those curly brackets. And we want a semicolon there to end our command. So we're going to have a very simple function. Alert circle clicked. Okay, let's see if that worked. Brilliant. So we've recreated the document.getElementById, which we used in the JavaScript chapter, and the onClick function. Okay, I said I'd point out a few ways in which we can select things differently. So let's have a quick look at what would happen if we wanted to select the squares instead of the circles. Well, what we would do, you might be able to guess. Instead of the hash symbol, we use the dot because we're selecting by a class rather than an ID. And then we just give the name of the class. So square. See what happens there. So now if I click on the circle, nothing happens. But if I click on the squares, it still says, it says circle clicked, doesn't it? Let's change it to square clicked. There we go. And if I click on that one too. So that's one way in which jQuery is a little bit more easy or a little bit more powerful than JavaScript, because we can very easily select multiple elements and do something with them at the same time. In JavaScript you can do that, but it's a little bit more complicated. Okay, the last thing for this chapter is we don't have to actually use IDs or classes at all. We can use element names, for example. So maybe I want to select all of the divs. Then this time I don't use a hash or a dot because I'm not using an element or ID to select my elements. I'm actually using the element type. So I can just put div in there, and then let's change the alert to div clicked. And now when I click on the circle, I get div clicked, and the same thing with both of those squares. So each of the divs is selected. If I click somewhere else, there's no div there, so nothing is alerted. So this is a really powerful use of jQuery just at the very beginning. We can use it to select IDs, classes, or any element type just there. So I suggest you try a few things out. Maybe try and put a few links in there and see what happens when you apply the click function to those. Now we're going to see how we can use jQuery to change website content in the same way that we changed the website content with plain JavaScript last time round. So I'm going to keep my circle, but get rid of my squares. And I'm going to add a paragraph of text. There we go. Okay. So very simply now I'm going to change the content of the text when I click on the green circle. So can you update the code there to change it from selecting a div to changing it to selecting the circle ID? Did you manage it? It's very simple. Simply change it from div there to hash for an ID, and then the ID name, which is circle. Always good to just check that that's up and running. There it is. We've got div clicked. That's fine. So now when the circle is clicked, what we want to do is change the content of the P, the paragraph tag. So another quick challenge for you. Can you select the paragraph tag? Did you manage it? I hope you did something like string P, like that. So that will select all of the paragraph tags on this page. We've only got one, so that's fine. If we had lots of paragraph tags and we only wanted to select one of them, then we'd need to give this paragraph tag an ID or a particular class. So it's very simple with JavaScript to change the content of a paragraph tag. We just use the HTML function. So we've selected the paragraph and we're applying the HTML function, and let's just change it to the text has been changed. Okay, see if that works. Terrific. There we go. So the HTML function is a really useful one in JavaScript that allows you to change the HTML function is a really useful one in jQuery that allows you to very simply change the content of a particular element. It also allows you to actually get the content of a particular element if you wanted to do that. So if I wanted to alert the text inside this paragraph tag, then all I would do is get rid of the contents of those brackets there, and then this will just return the content of the paragraph tag. So I can very simply alert that Let's see what that does. So that's taken the content of the paragraph tag and alerted it. And this is a general principle for jQuery functions. If you put some content in the brackets, generally speaking, that will update a particular attribute of an element. But if you leave nothing in the brackets, then it will return the contents or the attribute that you're looking for. So that's a really useful distinction to be aware of, and you can use one function then in two different ways. Let's just quickly see another function that we can use. Instead of click, we can use a function called hover. And we'll go back to changing the HTML. For now, we'll just call it changed. So this is a nice example of how simple jQuery is. Instead of using click, we're now using the hover function. And that means all I need to do is hover over this element and it changes the text. So that hover function is a very useful, quick one if instead of clicking you want your website to interact with a hover. Right, the last thing I'm going to show you this time round is changing an attribute of a particular element. So let's get an iframe in there. And we'll use the CNN website as the content of our iframe. There it is. I won't bother stretching it out. But what if we wanted to change the src of this iframe tag? Well, again, JSR. So I want to start by finding out the source of my iframe element. I know what it is, obviously, but it can be useful to return this bit of information in a script. So I'm going to select the iframe like that. Again, that would select all of the iframes on the page, which is fine for us because we've only got one. But if you had more than one iframe on a page, then you would want to give your iframe a particular class or ID in order to specify that you want to select that particular iframe. So if I want to get the src attribute of my iframe, I use the attr function. So the attr is short for attribute, and it allows you to return any attribute of an element. So I want to return the src of my element, and let's just alert that for now. So that should alert, whoops, the src attribute of this iframe when I hover over there. There it is. Fantastic. So we've got the source attribute of the iframe. What if we want to change it? Well, give that a go. See if you can adjust the code so that you're changing the source attribute of the iframe rather than just returning it. Did you manage it? What you needed was to get rid of the alert function, and then you add a second command. And the second command gives or second variable really, gives the new source that you want to apply to this iframe. So I'm going to use my ecowebhosting.co.uk homepage. So that's taken the iframe element, and this time, instead of returning the src attribute, we're actually changing the src attribute to this value of ecowebhosting.co.uk. Let's take a look. So this time I'm going to hover over there, and there we go. So we've changed the src attribute this time, not just returned it. So hopefully you're beginning to get to grips with how jQuery works, how we can select elements and how we can change their content. So let's have a look at how we can change styles of elements using jQuery. As you might expect, the syntax is very similar to changing the content of elements. We use the CSS function, is the only major difference. So first of all, let's get rid of our iframe and our p tag and bring back our squares. There's our square class. Great. So now we've got our circle and our two squares. There they are. So this time, what we're going to do is change the width of our squares a little bit. So the squares are a little bit wider and also a little bit taller. There they go. And we're going to return the width of the square elements when we click on them. That's the plan. So a quick little challenge for you. Can you change this function so that instead of activating whenever the circle is hovered over, it actually activates whenever a square is clicked? Alright, hopefully you did something like changed the selector to .square and the hover function to a click function. Right, so now this function will take place whenever the square elements are clicked. So let's start by selecting the square elements again. And now we want to return, their width. So all we do is we use the CSS function and then we input the CSS attribute that we want to select, in this case the width. So this little bit of code here will return the width of the square. Let's just alert that and see what it does. Great, there we go. So the width of the square is indeed 300 pixels. Obviously we could quite easily change that to return the height or the background color or the margin top or anything that you wanted to know about that square. Now, what about if we wanted to change the code so that instead of only working on squares, it actually worked on all of the elements on the page, so that when I clicked on any of them, it would return the width of that element? Well, we can do that surprisingly easily. So first of all, a quick challenge for you. Can you make this function so that it runs whenever we click any element on this page, rather than just when we click on a square? I'm hoping you changed .square to div, because that will then select all of the div elements to run when we click on them. Now this is the new bit for you. Instead of selecting the square, we now want to select the item which was clicked, or the element which was clicked. And we can do that using a JavaScript function, which is also used a lot in jQuery, called this. And that's a really useful, really powerful function which allows us to select whichever element we're dealing with at the moment. So whichever element is clicked, this function will refer to that particular element. So let's just see how that works. If I now click on the circle, it gets the width of the circle. If I click on a square, it gets the width of the square. So this is a really useful technique. We're actually selecting a number of different elements on the page and then doing something specific with that particular element which was clicked. And we do that by using the this function. Right, what about if we wanted to change the CSS of this particular element? Well, it works in exactly the same way as with the attribute function that we saw in the last video. We just put the width that we want to change it to. So let's say we want to change the width to 400 pixels. You need to put the pixels at the end of the instruction, because it could be 400% or 400 EMs if you're doing it slightly differently. So let's see what that does. Click on there and it changes the width. Changes the width of that. It's no longer a circle. These are no longer squares. Great. So we've managed to change the CSS of an element when we click on it. We can do some other things too. We can hide elements when we click on them. Now, we learned to do that in JavaScript by setting the display to none. So let's just see if we can do that here as well. In fact, give it a go for yourself. See if you can change the display to none when the elements are clicked. Did you manage it? I'm hoping you did something like changed the width attribute to display and the value to none. So now when we click on any of those elements, they disappear. Great. There is a shorthand, however, in jQuery for doing that. We can actually use the hide function. So again, very simple. jQuery allows us to use a number of functions which just make our code a bit cleaner, a bit nicer, and a bit easier to look at. That just does exactly the same thing as before. So it just sets the display attribute to none. One last thing to show you. jQuery has actually got fading built in to it. So instead of using the hide function, we can use the fade out function. See how that looks? Nice. So it's got a little fade effect to it there. Now the fade out function is actually quite complicated and has a lot of power, a lot of ways that you can change it to speed up or slow down the fade or do a particular function when the fade is complete. But we won't look into all those details now. I've got a last little challenge for you. Can you make it so that when you click on the circle, the squares fade out? I hope you managed it. I would solve it by selecting the circle, because that's the element that we want to click on to run this function. And then instead of this, we want to select the squares, like that, and we want to fade them out. See if that works. If I click on the circle, out go the squares. At the end of the last video, we saw how to fade out content. I'm going to start looking in more detail here at the fade out function and also the fade in function that goes with it. We're going to start with a little challenge for you. Can you set up a paragraph of text and a button underneath so that when you click on the button, the text fades away? Did you manage it? I hope you did something like this. I'll do my classic, this is some text in my paragraph, and then I'll use a button. I'll give it an ID this time. Call it fader. Fade out will be the content of the button. And then I want to run my function when the fader button is clicked. And I want to fade out the paragraph. Let's take a look. Fade out works great. Okay, hope you managed to do something similar with your website. This time we're going to look in a bit more detail at the fade out function. So let's just first of all have a look at the jQuery docs. So if you search for any jQuery function, then you'll be sent to the jQuery page by Google. And they're extremely useful. So if ever I mention a function or you want to find out more about a particular function that we're working with, this is the place to go. So you've got all the attributes, all the possibilities that you can use this function with, and then some really great examples about how the function works, and they're live examples as well. So you can actually play with them and see how they work right there and then on the file, on the website. So I definitely recommend taking a look at that whenever you want to find out more about a function. But for now, we're just going to do a couple of things with this function. So we're going to first of all set up a second button that will allow us to fade the text back in. And that's fairly easy to do. We'll copy and paste the text of this button. And we'll call the new one fader in. And we'll change the text to fade in. Right, quick challenge for you then. Can you make it so that when we click on the fader in button, then the text is faded back in? I hope you managed it. I'm just going to copy this text here. We'll copy that code. And this time we want to select the fader in button. And instead of fading out the paragraph, we want to fade it in. So now we've got two buttons there. Of course, if I click the fade in button now, nothing will happen because the text is already there. The paragraph is already showing, so it doesn't need to fade in. But if I fade it out first, I can then fade it back in nice and easily. Great. Okay, the last thing we're going to see on this section is how to change some of the properties of this function. So first of all, we're going to change the speed of the fade. And that's pretty easy to do. We just put a number into the brackets, which will be the number of milliseconds that the fade out takes to complete. So 2000 milliseconds is equal to 2 seconds. So that's a nice slow fade. Let's fade it out. There we go. So a really slow fade there. If you want it to be a very fast fade, you could make it 50 milliseconds. And that's almost instantaneous as far as we're concerned. You can also use words such as fast. So a fast fade out is something like that. And you can use slow as a slow fade out. So we're changing the attributes of this function here so that it behaves in a slightly different way. Now the last thing we're going to do is to run a separate function when the fade out has completed. And this is known as a callback function. So the fade out will begin, and then when the fade out finishes, the script will call back the function that we want to run when the script is complete. So how do we do that? Well, we put a comma after our slow instruction. So we want to have a slow fade out, and then when that's completed, we want to run a function like that, and the content of the function will then go inside curly brackets in the usual way. So we've got it's very similar to the click function up there. It's just a callback function that we do when the fade out is complete. So for now, we'll just alert fade out complete. See if that works. Brilliant. There we go. So that's a good JavaScript general principle, is working with callback functions to complete a particular task or function when another task or function completes. Fading is just one example of animation, and animation is something that jQuery does extremely well. So let's find out how we can animate an object to make it larger or smaller or move it around the screen. We'll bring back our good old green circle. Whoops. There it is. Great, and what we're going to do is we're going to animate this green circle and make it gradually wider and wider up to a maximum of 300 pixels. So We'll select our circle. So we'll apply this animation when the circle is clicked. So a quick challenge for you, can you remember how to select this circle without using the #circle tag? Did you remember the this function? Or the this selector? There we go. Because we clicked on the circle itself, we can refer to the circle using this. Now we're going to use the jQuery animate function. And we do that simply by using .animate. Now the syntax for this function is a little bit complicated, but we'll take it very slowly. So the first attribute that we need to give to this function is to describe what changes we want to make to the circle. So to keep it simple to start with, we'll just change the width of the circle to 300 pixels. So we put our attributes inside curly brackets, like this. So curly brackets, and we want the width to be set to 300 pixels. Like that. So width, and then a colon, and then 300 pixels in quotes. And with the other thing we need to specify is the amount of time that we want to take the animation. So let's go for 1500 milliseconds. So about a second and a half. Okay, let's see this work. There we go. Great, so we've now got a bit of animation in our apps, which is a fantastic thing to be able to do. So let's just play around with this a little bit and see what else we can do. What if we want to have more changes than just the width? Let's change the height as well. I would recommend now splitting this onto several lines, just to keep it all nice and tidy. To separate our different attributes, we use a comma. And I would recommend putting them on different lines. You don't have to, but it keeps your code nice and clean. So let's change the height to 300 pixels as well. You don't need a comma after your last attribute. Okay, let's see that in action. There we go. It's no longer a circle, of course, because we didn't change the border radius. So let's add that in. Border radius. Notice that we're not using the CSS names for these. We're not using border dash radius. We're using the JavaScript names, which are generally exactly the same, but they don't have the dashes in, and the second, third, and fourth words are all capitalized. So we'll change the border radius to 150 pixels to keep our circle circular. See that work? There it is. Fantastic. As a last option, let's move it around a little bit as well. So we can do that by changing the left margin if we want to move it right. So margin left, let's change that to 100 pixels. Mustn't forget to have a comma at the end of the previous line. So now we're moving it as well as enlarging it. And let's do a margin top as well. And let's speed up the animation a touch. Nice. So you can imagine using this on or I hope you can imagine using this on a website where you've got a lot of small icons, and then when you click on one of the icons, it grows larger to help you see what you've clicked on. So it allows you to increase the usability of your site, as well as bringing in some nice fancy animations. Ajax is a very powerful JavaScript technology. It's not jQuery specific, but jQuery does it particularly well. It stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and .xml. Let's just unpack that name a little bit. So the asynchronous means that it happens in the background. So you can be running other bits of JavaScript code at the same time as the Ajax is running. JavaScript just means that it's a JavaScript technology. And XML is a type of code that we'll actually look at later on in the APIs chapter. We don't really need to worry too much about what XML is at this stage. And in fact, Ajax doesn't work specifically with XML. You can use it with any type of file, an HTML file, a JSON file is another file type we'll look at in the APIs section. Essentially, what Ajax does is it allows you to load other files from your web server whilst the user is doing something without actually refreshing the page. It was pioneered by Google when they were working on the Gmail web app, and they wanted the web app to be as powerful as possible and to involve as fewer page loads as possible. So when you're using Gmail or now any webmail client, you'll notice that you can do lots of things without the page actually reloading at all. And that means that the user experience is much faster and much more like a desktop app. So a lot of the very common sites these days, such as, well, Google, Twitter, Facebook, a lot of the websites that you use every day use Ajax a great deal in order to make your experience much better. So Ajax is a really useful tool to use. Let's find out what we can do with it. Now, a slight complication of using Ajax and jQuery is that it doesn't work over what's called the file protocol. Now, what I mean by that is, so far we've been running our files directly off our own computer, and that means that in the address bar up here, instead of the usual HTTP, which you see when you're browsing a website, we're using the file protocol, so file colon. Now, if I try and run Ajax on the file protocol, it won't work. So we need to do this part of the course on a real web server. So this is a good opportunity for me to remind you that you have free web hosting with this course. If you haven't set that up yet, then go to the first chapter of the course and find the videos that instruct you how to do that. Done that? Fantastic. So I'm going to go over to my Firefox setup here, where I've got Fire FTP installed. Again, if you can't get to this page, then go to the first section of the course and it will guide you through the process of getting here. So I've created a folder called Files on my CompleteWebDeveloperCourse.com website, and I'm going to create a new file there. So create file, and I'll call it index.html. And then I'm going to open that file, Command O, and that will open it up in Text Wrangler over here. Now I want the content of that index file to be the same as what I've got over here. So I'm going to copy all of that and paste it in. Great. One of the fantastic features of Fire FTP is that it will automatically save any changes that you make locally on the server itself. So let's just make sure that that's worked. If I go to CompleteWebDeveloperCourse.com/files/index.html, I can now see the Ajax title there. Great, so now I'm going to be editing the file on the server, not the file on my own computer, which will allow me to use Ajax. So with Ajax, I need a file to actually load the content of. So I'm going to go back to my server on Fire FTP and create another new file. I'll call it test.html. And then once that's created, I'll just open it up and put some basic content in there. So this is some content, very simple. You could put any HTML you like in there, but we'll keep it simple for now. And then I'll save that, and then I'll close that down, hide that part of the window. So now I'm just editing the index file. Always worth checking. Let's just make sure that that file is indeed online. Great. Okay, So let's go back to our index file and actually do some Ajax. So I'm going to start by showing you the jQuery get function. It's a very simple way to use Ajax and a great place to start. So how do we use it? We start with the string, as we so often do with jQuery, and then .get to call the get function. And then the only variable that we need to send to the get function is the location of our document that we want to load. So in this case, test.html. Great, that's it. That's our first Ajax call. If I refresh the page, nothing actually happens. That's because all we're doing here is getting the content of the test.html file. We're not actually doing anything with that content. So in order to do something with the content, we need to use a callback function, just like we did with the fade out function earlier. So we type function, and this time our function is going to need a variable, and that variable is, well, we'll call it data, and that data variable will be set to the value of the content of the test.html file. Just to say that again, what the get function does is it takes the content of the test.html file and puts it in the variable data, and then we can do whatever we like with it. So as before, we use curly brackets to separate out our function, and then I'm just going to alert the variable data, which should alert the contents of the test.html file. Let's give it a go. There it is. Fantastic. So that might look extremely simple, but what we've done there is very, very powerful. We've taken a bit of content on our web server and we've loaded it into the page that we've got at the moment without actually refreshing the page. And before we looked at Ajax, we had no way of doing that. Great. So we've done our first introductory bit of Ajax. Now the get function, however, is not what I'd recommend you use generally speaking. I'd rather you use the Ajax function. Now the get function is perfectly good and works perfectly well, but the Ajax function gives you a lot more control and power that the get function doesn't give you. Specifically, if the internet connection of the user goes down whilst they're using your website and you're using the get function, then just nothing will happen because they won't be able to get the results of the get call to your web server. Whereas with the Ajax function, you can set a fail method. So if the internet connection does go down, then you can alert the user to this fact and do something about it. So to call the Ajax function, we do a very similar thing to when we call the get function, and we just do string.ajax. And this time the URL is actually given as part of a number of different variables that we could give to the function in the function call. So we separate all our variables out just like we did in the animate function in curly brackets. We're only actually going to have one variable here, and that's the URL. There are lots of different attributes that you can put in here, but we'll just have the one for now and we'll see others later on. Okay, so that is our Ajax call, and we want to have a callback function once again that alerts the data when it's returned. So we use the done function, and then within that we want to have a function. Oops, let's spell it right. And just as with the get command, we need a data variable to store the data from the test.html file, and we put that in curly brackets and then close the done function, and finally we'll alert the data. Okay, let's take a look at that. There it is. Oh, that's actually the get function was returning first and then the Ajax function, so it's done it twice. So let's get rid of the get function because we don't need that anymore, and just make sure that all is well there. Fantastic. Okay, so just to show you another couple of things that you can do with the data function, maybe we want to change the content of the header to whatever is in that test.html file. So there's a quick challenge for you. See if you can do that. I hope you managed it. It's pretty straightforward. We just select the h1 element, and then we set the HTML to data, or the value of the data variable. Let's see that in action. Fantastic. Really good. One final jQuery command to show you here is append, which can be a very useful way if you don't want to get rid of the content of your h1 tag, but you want to append something to it, so add something at the end of it, then you just use the append command, and then we'll see the h1 loads, and then the content of the HTML file loads after it. So that may seem a long way round getting some content from a file and putting it in, but what we've done there is actually extremely powerful, and we'll use it a lot to create complex and interesting and interactive and fast web applications. Regular expressions is an extremely powerful tool which works not just in jQuery and JavaScript, but in any programming language. Simply put, a regular expression is a pattern of characters which you can then use to see if a particular string is of a particular format. You might use it to see if a string contains a particular word, or is in the format of an email address, or a whole range of other uses. So let's dive straight in and see how regular expressions, or regex, works. I'm going to go back to my desktop file now. So I'm going to close down completewebdeveloper.com, and I've got my learning jQuery document back. I've cleared out the contents of the body. I just need to put my script tag back in. So we define a regular expression in a very similar way to normal variables. We start with var, and we'll call this regex. Now the difference is, instead of using quotes to contain our regular expression, we use slashes. So for the moment, our first regex variable is just going to be the word great inside slashes. Now, how do we use that? Well, we need a second variable. We'll call this string, and we'll set it to the value regex is great. Okay, so now we're going to simply use regex to determine whether or not the word great features in the variable string. And the way we do that is using the jQuery match function. So we take the string and we match it with the particular regex. That's it. So we've taken the string and we're using the match function on that string, and we're using the particular regex variable to match it with. So again, that won't do anything because it's just matching it. We need to actually return a value. So let's set a new variable, call it result, and set it equal to that match. And let's see what we get. So now we'll just alert result, and let's refresh this, see what happens. So what it does is it returns the result, which in this case is great because it's found the word great. Let's just see what happens if the word great is no longer there. We'll change the text a little bit. It returns null. So if we want to find out whether or not a particular string contains another string, then we'll we use the match command, and it will either return the string itself or it will return the null variable to show that it's not there at all. Now, a couple of other things that's worth checking out. If we spell great with a capital G there, and then run our regex, it won't return it because it will look for exactly that set of characters, so small g, R-E-A-T. If we want to do a case-insensitive search, we can add the I flag at the end of the regex string, and this will now do a case-insensitive search. So if I now run that, it returns great. So it's found it. Finally, we might want to search for a string that may appear inside another string many times. So let's see, for example, the letter E. If we, instead of using the I flag, we use the G flag. G is short in this case for global. So we're searching for every instance that E comes up in the sentence regex is great. So let's see what the result is in that case. It's a little array containing E, E, and E. So that shows us that there are 3 E's in the variable string. Now this might look reasonably straightforward and not particularly useful when you're doing it in this sort of context, but when you want to evaluate an email address, for example, or a password and make sure that it's of a specific format, or perhaps contains a number or contains a capital letter, then regex is an extremely useful way to do that. And that's what we'll see in the next video. Let's take a moment and remember what you've covered so far in this part of the course. So you've been introduced to jQuery as a JavaScript framework. You've seen how you can use jQuery to manipulate content and styles on a page. You've done some animation, fading items in and out and changing their CSS values gradually. And you've also done a bit of regex and Ajax, which are extremely powerful tools which you'll use a lot in your programming career. So we're going to try and put a little bit of that together in a form validation exercise. So I'm going to get you to do as much of this as I can, and I will lead you through it, but there'll be reasonably lengthy challenges for you to do. So I definitely recommend pausing the video when you get there and having a go at the challenge yourself. So form validation is the process of making sure that a form has been filled in correctly before you actually submit it. I'm sure you've been through form validation before when you come along and you mistype your email address and the form alerts you that it's not of the correct format for an email address, or your passwords don't match or something like that. So it's an extremely useful thing to do from the point of view of a website owner, because it helps the user correctly fill in the form and it very quickly alerts them to errors in their input. So let's find out how we do that. First of all, let's make a form. And because we know a bit of CSS now, we're going to try and make it reasonably attractive. So let's start by centering our form on the page. So your first challenge is to create a div which will be centered on the page and have a width of 500 pixels. All right, I'll do it like this. So I'm going to create a div with an ID of wrapper. Doesn't matter what the ID is, but wrapper is quite a common ID to use for a div that's going to completely contain your website. And then in order to center it, we apply some styles to wrapper, and we'll set the width to 500 pixels and the margin to 0 auto. And then that's the bit which actually centers it. And let's just put a little bit of code in there and get rid of my code from last time. There we go. So I can see I've got a nice centered background there. Great. Okay, so this is where our form is going to go. So let's just put a form input in. So your second little challenge is to create a form input and give it a name of email. Right, I'm hoping that you typed something like input name equals email and then close the tag. And there we go. Right, let's style that a little bit. So try and make it a little bit bigger, give it a fair bit of padding and give it some rounded corners. Off you go. Hope you managed it. I'll do it this way. So I'll use input to refer to this and all other inputs that we're going to have. And let's just experiment a little bit. Let's call the width 200 pixels, the height 40 pixels. We'll give it a padding of 5 pixels and a border radius of 5 pixels. Okay, that looks nice. I think the text is a little bit too small. So let's increase the font size to 1.2 EM. See how that looks. That's nice. I like it. I'm going to make the border a little bit thinner. We'll go for 1px solid grey. Okay, definitely a more attractive form than we had before. Okay, I think I will increase the width slightly though. So we've got plenty of room to play with. Great. Now I'm going to show you a new HTML element that we haven't seen before, and that is the label. So we just use a label command like that, and the label tag has a for element in it, and that helps define which input the label is for. Okay, and our label is going to contain the word email. There it is. Great. So you'll notice that the label not only looks reasonably nice, at least we need to format it a little bit there, but it's aligned itself nicely in the center of the box. It's also particularly good for those people who use screen readers or a different way to browse the web. They can view the label and they will know that the label is attached to a particular input element. So I definitely recommend putting labels in your forms. So I'm going to change the font to Helvetica. Take a look at that. Yep, nice. I'm going to make it a little bit larger, so everything matches up. Okay, great. That's had the result of increasing that a little bit, but that's fine. Now, with my label, I want to make it a particular width so that everything lines up nicely when I've got several different elements on this page. To do that, I need to set the width. Let's go for 150 pixels. And I also need to make sure that the label is floated to the left. Now, when I do that, you'll notice that unfortunately we lose the nice center aligning there. So we're going to need to add a bit of padding. Let's try out 5 pixels, see how that looks. No, a bit more, I think. 10 pixels. Nice. Okay. Right, so we've got our email and then our email input. I begin to think the email input is a little bit too large, so I'm going to change the height to 30 pixels and change the padding to 7 pixels. Okay, I'm liking that. Looks good. Let's have a few more elements in our form. We'll have a phone number. So we'll just call it telephone and we'll give it a name of phone. See how that looks? A little bit too close, I think. So let's set a little margin at the bottom of our inputs. Try 10 pixels. Great, that's separating out nicely. Okay, so email, telephone, and we're going to also have a password. We'll call this pass. Now, for password fields, you don't really want the text of the password to display, because if someone's entering their password and someone else is sharing their computer, then they don't want that person to be able to see their password. So all you need to do is change the type of the input to password, and then the browser will then not show any of the values that they're typing in, which is great. And then the last one that we're going to have in this form is going to be a password confirmation. Okay, great. It would be nice if they were all on a single line, so I'm going to increase the width of everything a little bit. So let's increase our wrapper to 600 and our label to 200. See how that works. Okay, nice. I'm liking how our form looks. Now we just need a button for the user to press when they've finished the form. And we do that with another input with a type of submit. And we set the value of a submit button to whatever we want the text on that button to be. So we'll just set it to submit with a capital S. Okay, great. I think we could do with styling that submit button a little bit. So let's give it an ID of submit button. Try and spell it right. So let's give it a height of perhaps 50 pixels. Okay, that looks good. And let's move it around a little bit. I'd like to line it up with the boxes on the top. So let's give it a margin left of 150 pixels. A little bit more. Nice. Then I think I'd like to change the width to 100 pixels. Okay, nice. You can style your form any way you like. This is just what I'm going to do. So now what we want is for something to happen when we click that submit button, and that's where we're going to do our validation. So we're going to use our form HTML tag to contain everything. And we'll give our form an ID. Call it validation form. Okay, so now in comes the JavaScript and the jQuery to do something with this. So we want our script to run when we submit the form. There's two ways we could do that. We could look at the button itself and say when the button is clicked, or we could look at the form and look at when the form is submitted. The latter is generally a better option because that allows us to look at the particular values of things within the form. And we haven't seen it before, so let's do it that way. So can you write some jQuery to select the form with an ID of validation form? Okay, hopefully you did something like this validation form, so the hash for the ID, and then validation form is the name of the ID of the element that we're going for. Now we're going to use the jQuery submit function. Nice and simple. So this code will run when the form is submitted, i.e. when the submit button is clicked. So we want to run a function, and this particular function is based around an event. So the event is the event of the form being clicked. So don't worry too much about the details there, but that event is going to be important shortly. So, and then we'll put just a test in at the moment, just to make sure everything's working as we would like it to. Let's put some details in here. It doesn't matter what we put in for the moment. Okay, excellent. So our JavaScript is happening, but then what happens there? All of the values that we've entered have disappeared. Now, if we expand this here, you can see that what's happened is the form has actually been submitted. And when we get onto the PHP chapter of this course, we'll find out a lot more about these variables up here. They're known as get variables. And essentially, these are the values of what I typed into the form. So we've got the email that was SDF and the phone, which was the same, and the password, etc., etc. So we don't want that to happen. So we need to stop the form actually being submitted. And the way that we do that is use a function called prevent default. So I take my event, which remember is this variable here, which is equal to the form being submitted, and I use the prevent default function. So that's how we stop the default event actually happening, i.e. stopping the form being submitted. So let's just check that that works okay. Again, I'll just put some demo content in there. So if we submit that test, great, the form is not actually submitted. So now we need to start doing our validation. So let's start by validating our email address. Now, validating an email address is actually a reasonably complicated thing to do, but we're going to use regex, which we're now familiar with, and we're going to use a pretty complicated regex formula, which we can get nice and easily from the web. So I'm just going to enter jQuery validate email address. There it is. And we'll go to the top result, and we've got a nice function here. So we've got our pattern is our regular expression, and you can see that's a really complicated long pattern. We're not going to go into the details of how that all works. You can read more about it online if you want to, but for now we're just going to use this function. So there we go. There's our function. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of how this really complicated regular expression works, but it does. So how do we actually use that? Well, we've defined a function here. The function is valid email address, and that will return a success if it is a valid email address and a fail if it's not. So we use it like this. So if is valid email address, and we need to put our email address into the function itself. So the email address, let's now go back to our form, is the value of the email content there. So if we were to change that to asdf@asdf.com, we'd want to get hold of that particular email. So what we'll do, we'll go back up to our form and we'll give it an ID of email, and that just makes it really easy to refer to when we're using our jQuery here. So quick challenge for you. Can you get the value of this input with an ID of email? Did you manage it? Well, you just have to select the element with an ID of email, and then we use the jQuery val command, and that then returns our email address. Okay, so now we've got a statement that says if it is a valid email address, do something. We're actually more concerned about if it isn't a valid email address. So the way we do that is we put an exclamation mark in the front of our command, and this will look for essentially if this function returns false. So if it's not a valid email address. So what do we want to do if it's not a valid email address? Well, for now, let's just alert something so that we can test this function out. And make sure it's working as it should. Right, let's try this out. So if I put an invalid email address there, then it says not valid. Fantastic. If I put in a valid email address, it does nothing. Great. So you can experiment a little bit with that and make sure that it catches all of the different types of invalid email addresses. This regex should be pretty thorough. It should get pretty much every email address that isn't valid. Okay, so what we want to do is alert the user to this, but we don't want to have pop-ups that get in the way every time. So what we really want to do is have a nice area where we can put our error messages and the user can then see those error messages. So let's add a div above the form, and we'll give it an ID of error. And initially it'll just be an empty div, so we won't be able to see it at all. So in this case, if the email is invalid, we want to put an error message on that div. So there's your challenge. Can you make it so that if it's an invalid email address, it gives an error into the error div? I hope you managed it. It's reasonably straightforward. We just need to set the HTML of the error div to something like, please enter a valid email address. Okay, let's see if that works. Brilliant. Okay, that's great. So we've got our error message. I think it might be worth styling that a little bit. So again, quick challenge for you. Can you style this error message so it looks more like an error message? I hope you managed to do that. So I'm going to give the div some default content so that I can keep refreshing the page and don't have to fill in the form to get the error every time. And now we'll just make it a red error message. I think that'll be enough. Maybe a bit of a margin so it's separated out a little bit. Okay, great. That margin will also have the effect of pushing our form down a little bit, which in this case really doesn't matter. It might be that you want to hide that error message and only show it when you need it if you want to, but I think we don't need to do that in this case. Okay, so all good so far, but we're going to have a slight problem when we start introducing these other error messages as well, because what if we have more than one error message at once? Well, a good way to deal with that is to have a variable which is equal to our error. So let's call it error message. And at the moment it can be blank, so we don't need to put anything in that error message. In fact, let's set it to be empty at the start of this function. So we've got an empty error message variable. And then, so instead of actually setting the HTML of the error div to please enter a valid email address, we can set the error variable, so the error message variable, to please enter a valid email address. And the nice thing about that is, at the end of, once we've done all our validation, we can then set the value of the error div to error message. Let's just make sure that works. So we've got an invalid email address. Great. So now we've got our email validation working nicely. Let's do a bit of telephone validation. I'm going to copy this. But this time I don't want to validate an email address. I want to check if the telephone is numeric. I don't want any numbers or letters in my, I don't want any letters or punctuation in my telephone number. I want only a number. Now there's a nice jQuery function that does this for us. It's called isNumeric. So all we need to do is get our phone value, and we'll need to give it an ID, so we'll call it phone. So now I've got my phone number. I just want to check if it's numeric or not, and the function that we're going to use is dot is numeric, like that, and then we put brackets around our phone number there. So that will tell us if the number is numeric. We actually want to know whether it is not numeric. So we put exclamation mark in the front there, just like we did with the email address. And then we're going to set the error message to please enter a valid phone number. Okay, let's take a look at that. So if I put some letters in the phone number, we now get please enter a valid phone number. Great. We do have a slight problem though at the moment. If I enter an invalid email address and an invalid telephone number, then we just get the message about the phone number. So what can we do about that? Well, an easy way to deal with it is to set the error message equal to whatever the error message was before plus please enter a valid phone number. So let's take a look at that, see what that does. So invalid email and invalid telephone. Okay, so we've got both messages now, but we do have an issue with them being on the same line. So an easy fix for that is to just put a line break at the beginning of each error message. And again, that's going to have the effect of moving our content down a little bit. I think that's fine in this case, but you may want to play around a little bit with your own form. Let's just take a look. Invalid email, invalid telephone. Great. We've now got both of those messages. Great. So the third and final one that we're going to look at is making sure that both passwords are the same. So the next challenge is to try and make a third validation where you're looking at the two passwords and confirming that they're the same. I hope you got there. It's reasonably straightforward, I think. It's just a matter of giving your if statement the two values of the different passwords and checking if they're the same. So let's call them ID of pass1, and this one can have an ID of pass2. Great, and what we want to know is the value of pass1 different to the value of pass2. Let's put put the vowels in there. And let's put that in the right place as well. So this essentially says if the value of pass1 is not equal to, put some spaces in there to spread that out a little bit, the value of pass2, then the error message needs to state that their passwords don't match. So please enter matching passwords. Okay, so let's just make sure that that all validates nicely. There we go. We've got 3 error messages there. And let's check if I do actually enter a valid email address and submit that, then that error message goes away. Brilliant. So it's all looking pretty good. All we need now is to do something if they've actually managed to fill the form in successfully. So how will we know at the end of this bit of script whether or not they filled in the form successfully? I'll set that challenge to you. See if you manage it. I think the easiest way to tell is to look at the content of the error message string, because this error message string was set to 0 or set to empty at the beginning of this function. And then if all of these turn out to be fine and valid, then the error message string will still be empty. So all we need to do is say if the error message string is equal to nothing, if it's empty, then for now we'll just alert success. And if it's not, then we'll give them an error message. Okay, let's take a look at that. So if I put in lots of invalid data, I still get my messages. Let's put in a valid phone number. That's great. Okay, I'm getting there. I now want a valid email address. Hurrah, just need to make my passwords match. Fantastic, we've got it. So there you have it, a pretty basic but very functional email and telephone and password validation system. There are various plugins you can get for jQuery to do this for you, but it's always good to know how to do it yourself from scratch. So now we're going to spend a few minutes looking at the jQuery UI plugin. So let's take a quick look at the website to remind ourselves what it looks like. So essentially it's a user interface plugin for jQuery. So it features a lot of very easy ways to set up draggable objects, resizable objects, selectable objects, all the things you can see down here on the left. So it's well worth getting familiar with because it can make your life a lot easier when you're designing complicated web apps. And we're just going to cover some of the basics in this video and the next couple of videos. So the first thing we need to do to get jQuery UI up and running is embed the JavaScript in our page, just like with jQuery. So it's very simple. We just add a script tag with a type of text /JavaScript. Now this time we're going to use the Google hosted version of jQuery UI. You're very welcome to download the version and use a local version on your own machine if you like, but just for ease and to show you another way of doing it, we're going to use the online version here. So there we go. Google APIs is a store of a great range of widely used web frameworks, and jQuery UI is one of them. If you want to get the address of any particular jQuery plugin or anything like that, then just Google it and it'll come up. So there we go. We've got our jQuery UI plugin installed. So let's just get a draggable element. So nice and easy. Let's create our good old square. So we'll just have a single square. You can style it as you like. I'll keep things simple. And we'll just have a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels and a background color of grey this time. Okay, let's just take a look at that. Great, that's what I want. Now, of course, if I try and drag that div around, nothing happens. So how do I actually use my jQuery UI to make something draggable? It's extremely straightforward. All you need to do is select your div. So square, and then use the function draggable. That's it. And now let's have a look. I can now drag that around and it moves around with me. Fantastic. As with all of the ones that we're going to look at here, the jQuery UI functions, there are lots of customizations that you can do to that. So if you want it to work in a particular way, then you can do. If you want to run a particular function when the drag is complete, all of that can be done quite easily. I'm not going to go into the details of all of those in these videos, but if you want to look at them in more detail, then the jQuery UI website is the place to go. So in our first video for jQuery UI, I'm going to show you two really useful functions, draggables and resizables. And we'll start with draggables. So here in front of me, I've got an empty web page. You can see I've got the usual jQuery in there, and I've also got a link to jQuery UI. So make sure that you get this link in your page when you're working with jQuery UI, or it won't work. And we're going to start with a very quick challenge. Can you create a green square with the text "drag me around" in it? Okay, I hope you managed that. I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to create a div with an ID of draggable. And I'm going to put the text "drag me around" and then close the div. And then up here in the head, I'm going to add some styles. And they're all going to be for the draggable ID. And I'm going to give it a width of 200 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, a background color of green. And let's take a look. Excellent. If only I'd spelled around correctly, that would have been perfect. Great. Okay, so we've got our green square. So now, of course, our aim is to make this square draggable. At the moment, if I drag it, of course, nothing happens. But making it draggable with jQuery UI is extremely straightforward. So let's see how we do it. I'm just going to create my script at the bottom. And now all we do is we reference the draggable ID, and I'm just going to pause a moment for you to remember how to do that. Okay, hopefully you did something like that. So the dollar symbol calls jQuery, and then we've got the draggable with the hash sign telling us that we want the draggable ID, and then all we do is add draggable. That's it. Nice. Save. Refresh. And there we go. Fantastic. Super easy to do something that would take quite a long time to do with just plain old JavaScript. Great. Now for resizables, we need to bring in the jQuery UI CSS file, which gives us some extra styles that some of the jQuery UI functions need. So I'm going to show you how to get that. Well, I'm just going to search for jQuery UI CDN. You remember that CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. So it's a way that you can access the jQuery files directly. I'm going to go for the Google ones, and then I'm just going to search for jQuery UI. There it is. And you can see we've got the jQuery UI JS, which is what I'm using here. And then for the CSS, I'm just going to pop that in above it there. Great. So now we've got the jQuery UI default CSS, which is one of the smoothness themes, and also the jQuery UI JavaScript. Great. So we're now going to create another square. I'm going to let you choose your color this time, and I won't pause, but if you want to pause now and create a square of your own, please do. I'm just going to call it resizable, and this will say resize me, and close the div, and don't forget that. And then, in fact, I'll just copy this, resizable, and we'll make it red just for a bit of variety. And there we go, underneath there. So you might be able to guess how we actually make it resizable. All we need to do is refer to it. So our resizable, and then we use the resizable method to apply that property to it. And just before we run that, we do need to add HTTP, because remember we're using the file protocol here, so we need to make sure that it is downloading this from the web and not trying to download it from our local file system. Okay, let's have a look. Now you can see this one's got a little kind of handle on the bottom there. That's where the CSS comes in, and then if we just grab that handle, we can resize it super easily. So now we can play around with this as much as we like. So you can hopefully start to see that jQuery UI very easily gives you the tools to create interactive websites and web apps, which allows for a much better user experience. In the next few videos, we'll look at some of the other things that jQuery UI can do. So moving swiftly on, we've got our nice draggable square here, which we can now do whatever we like with or move it around in any way we like. The other useful thing that goes with draggable is droppable. So if you want to have an item that then goes into another item, so you might want to put a box into a bigger box for some reason, or just have a nice user interface where people can interact with your website graphically by dragging things around, then this is a really good way of doing it. So let's create a new div, which is going to be our target div, which is where we're going to drop our square into. Again, you can style these however you like. I'll make it a little bit bigger. And give it a background color of yellow. There we go. So I can still move that square around. I obviously can't do anything with this one as yet. So how does this work? Well, we first of all have to get our target div. So we just select it in the usual way. And now we want to make it droppable. Fantastic. Now it's not quite as simple as just making it droppable though, because we have to give various options to make this work. So let's specify our options. So the most important option that we need is the drop option. So this essentially decides what we should do once the square has been dropped into the target. So it's going to be a function. This function actually takes two variables, two inputs, UI and event. I'm not going to go into details about what those are. We don't really need to interact with them in any way here, but if you want to, then you're very welcome to have a little read about it on the jQuery UI website. And as always, we'll enclose our function in curly brackets. So let's just do a quick alert for now, just to make sure our code is working. So we drag this around, let go, and it's dropped. Brilliant. So a nice way to show this might be to change the background color of the target square to red or something like that. So I'll leave that as a quick challenge for you to try. I hope you managed it. All we need to do is to select the background, which is the target div, and change the CSS background color to red. Okay, now when we do that, there we go. So that's a really nice visual way to allow your users to interact with your website. In this video, I'm just going to show you a couple of other jQuery UI functions which may come in useful for you. The two that we're going to look at here both require the jQuery UI themes style sheet to be in there. There's various themes for the jQuery UI which are just different looks and color schemes. I'm going to use the standard one, which is smoothness, which just makes everything look a bit nicer. You can of course customize it any way you like, but we'll use this one for now. So going back to our body, we're going to create a selection of divs, each of which have a title. And I'm thinking that this would be a kind of FAQ or a set of instructions on how to use your app or something like that. But we'll just do some demo text for now. There we go. Plenty of text there. Close our paragraph tag. Close our div, and then we'll create a few of those. So there we go. If you've got a lot of information to display, this could be quite intimidating to the user and they don't necessarily need to see all of it. So you might want to just have the title showing and then be able to allow the user to click on a particular title to read one thing at a time. And that's what this accordion function does extremely well. So all you need to do is take your content and surround it with a div. We'll give it an ID of accordion, but it doesn't really matter what the ID is. Close the div there, and then you may be able to guess how this works. We just select the accordion by its ID and run the accordion function on it. Okay, let's see how that looks. Much nicer, much more manageable, even though my text doesn't look very friendly. And then if you click on any one of these, they just open and close whichever one is already open. So a really handy shortcut to avoid displaying a large amount of text on the screen at any one time. So that's the accordion. The other one I want to show you is sortable lists, which are also very useful. You might have a form where you want them to rate a certain set of objects or whatever it might be, and to be able to drag them up and down and put them in order is a very, very useful, very nice way of interacting with a website. So let's see how we can do that. All we need to do is create our list in the usual way. I'll go for some foods again. We'll have good old staples. Pizza, cheese, tomatoes, and chocolate. Okay, so if we have a look at that, that's just a standard list. Now, if we select our UL like that and apply the sortable function to it, it now becomes a sortable list. So again, a very fantastically easy way to do something that would take quite a long time to actually code by hand. Congratulations on making it to the end of the jQuery part of the course. You've covered a huge amount of jQuery and hopefully wrote a great deal of code yourself. Now for the challenge, we're going to create a code player website, which is pretty much a copy of jsbin.com, which is a great website in itself that allows you to put HTML, CSS and JavaScript right there on the site and then run it to see how it looks. So it saves you having to collect it all together, and you can just run it there in the browser. So this is the demo of CodePlayer that I've put together. You can see that you can visualize the HTML and the result initially. And if you click on the CSS and JS, then you get to view the style sheets and the JavaScript as well. And you can toggle all of those and they go on and off as needed. So you can give yourself plenty of room to code. And then when you run the script, it then, you can see, has run the JavaScript there. It's just alerted the number 7. And it's also inserted a test div ID into what is actually an iframe over there. And it's applied the CSS with a bit of background styling there as well. So it's a reasonably advanced website, pretty complicated, but I think you can manage it. In fact, it doesn't use any techniques that you haven't covered yet, except for a very little bit in that very last step. So if you're feeling bold, I'd say pause the video now and try and create as much of this as you can. You should be able to create at the least the layout of the CodePlayer page, and you should be able to do a little bit of the functionality as well in terms of these toggles and the varying widths of the divs and the text areas which are in there. So pause the video now and do as much as you can, and then feel free to tune in and out as I explain the way that I would do it. Right, so we'll start from scratch, as we always do. Line up everything nicely. So I'll empty out this file here and get rid of all our styles. We don't need, we'll keep the jQuery. I don't think we're going to be using jQuery UI here, although you might want to. So we can get rid of those. So we'll just keep the jQuery. Right. So let's settle in. I'll just save that and refresh there. So there we've got our blank page. So first off, let's try and create this header area. So I'm going to create a wrapper div, which will contain the whole page. That's just something I do pretty much every website that I create. It's often very useful to have a wrapper div and just gives you a bit more control over everything. So let's create another div for the menu bar. We'll call it menu bar. Close the div there. And now let's bring in some styles. add our menu bar. So we want our menu bar to be all the way across the site, so to have a width of 100%. We'll start with a height of, let's say, 40 pixels, and we'll see how that works out. And we'll have a background color. We want a kind of light gray, so I'm going to use my color picker, my Chrome plugin, and just choose a very light gray, maybe that one there. So E0, E0, E0. Great. Don't forget the hash. And the last thing we'll put there is a border at the bottom to just separate it out. It's going to be slightly darker, so we'll just use grey. Okay, now that looks all right, but obviously we've got this issue around the edge here. So I think what we're going to need to do is set the margin and the padding of the body to 0. Great. So now we've got our basic layout at the top. So let's start putting in, first of all, our logo. So we'll call it a logo, even though it'll just be some plain text. So I'm going to call mine Code Player. You might want to use a different name for yours. Let's just see how that looks in itself. Yeah, looks fine. But I definitely want to play around with the font. I don't like the default. I'm going to show you a site that I use quite often when I want to get nice fonts. It's called Better Helvetica. It's just a quick CSS trick. And what it does, if I copy and paste this into my body, you'll remember that the font family attribute has values that it will take each font and try and apply that font if the system has it. And if it doesn't, then it will back off and try the next font, and on and on and on and on and on. So if you're on a Mac, generally speaking, you have the Helvetica Neue Light installed by default, whereas most Windows machines probably won't. So this will start off with what one might consider to be the nicest font, and then go simpler and simpler and simpler, and just end up with a sans serif one if there are no fonts at all on the system. So there we go. Now we've got this nice clean, thin font there. But we're going to want to change that a little bit. So let's add a bit of padding to the menu bar. Or actually, no, I'll think twice about that. I'll put it in the logo instead, because we might want to have different paddings for the central part of the menu bar and the button on the right. So let's try some padding at the top of 5 pixels. I'm not too bothered about the padding on the right or the bottom, but we definitely want some padding on the left. Let's say 20 pixels and see how that looks. Okay, not bad. We could definitely do with bolding it up a little bit, and we could probably increase the font size a touch. See how that looks. Nice. Okay, that's good enough. It's not a great logo, but it'll do the job for this site. Okay, so there's our logo. That's going to be on the left of the menu bar, so we're actually going to need to float that left. It's the only thing there at the moment, so it won't make any difference, but next we're going to bring in our button, which is going to be our run button, which we press whenever we want to run our code. So we'll create a button div to contain our button. And then within that we want a button, and that will just say run. We'll give the button an ID and we'll call it run button. There we go. Okay, fine. We definitely want it to be on the right. So let's get our button div and float it to the right. Great. And a little bit of padding would be useful. So let's try another 5 pixels on the top. And say 10 pixels on the right. Not worried about the bottom or the left. Okay, that's pretty nice. I think we want the text to be a little bit larger, so let's go for our run button and change the font size. Let's try 120%, see how that looks. Nice. Okay, I'll take that. I think that's a perfectly reasonable looking run button. And the last bit we want is the menu buttons in the middle to toggle the various bits on and off. So let's create an unordered list. We'll give it an ID of toggles, and this will be our set of toggles. So we'll have an li for HTML. I'll copy that down. One for CSS, one for JavaScript, and one for the result div. Okay, looks pretty awful, but we can sort that. So let's get our toggles URL in. So first of all, you'll notice that we've got an extra bit of padding there. That's down to the margin of the UL. So if we set that to 0, that'll sort that out. We want to get rid of the list styling. So list style to none. I'll get rid of those bullet points. And we definitely want to float everything left in the li, so that they're all on a single line. Great. So the only thing left, I think we want to center it. So let's give it a width of 200 pixels for now, and a margin of 0 auto. Okay, it's looking good. Great. Now we definitely want to style that a little bit more though. So let's give them a bit of a border, and we'll need a height as well. So let's try 27 pixels, see what that does for us. Okay, we're looking better. Let's have a little look at the LIs and give them a bit of work. So we could do with a border right. To separate them out a little bit. Now, if we want that border to go all the way to the top, we actually want to remove the padding here, which will take them to the very top. And we also want to add in a bit of padding here instead. 5px there. Okay, that looks pretty nice actually. So we'll have 5px on the top and the bottom. Maybe we'll give them a bit more padding on the left and the right. See how that looks? A little too much padding. Okay, nice. So we definitely don't want that right border on the result function. So let's sneak in here and put in a style border none. Lovely. And let's finally remove all the padding from the UL so that we don't have that space on the left. Let's just move the whole thing down a little bit by giving it a relative position and top margin of 5 pixels. Great. It's looking pretty nice. So we've got our top bar. We'll worry about the actual toggling a little bit later on. We'll get all the styling sorted first, and then we'll bring in some JavaScript to do the work for us. So we're now outside of the menu bar. So let's bring in our first bit of code. So if we have a div, we're going to need several of these divs. So let's use class. So we'll have a class of code container. This is going to be our first chunk of code. And we'll give it an ID of HTML container. This is going to be the HTML one. Close that down. One thing we're going to need to do before that is break the floats, because we've got our left and right floats up there. We definitely want to have a div that breaks those for us. So we'll say clear both. Great. And then let's just make sure that hasn't messed anything up. Let's look at our code container class. And see what we want to do with that. So let's give it a background color for the moment so that we can see where it is. Blue. We want a height of, let's start with 100% for the moment, and a width of 50%. And we're going to want it to float left because we're going to have several of them, one after the other. And let's just put a little bit of content in there. Great. Okay, so we've got our 50% width. We haven't got our 100% height. Now we've got a slight problem with this actually. Because we've got our fixed div at the top, we actually want the height of this div not to be 100%, but to be 100% minus whatever that div is, whatever the height of that div is. There's a number of different ways to do that. You can do it with CSS, but I'm going to show you a way to do it with JavaScript. So let's get our script tags up and running. So if we want to set the height of the code container div to be equal to the height of the window minus the height of that top bar, or the menu bar, then we need to first work out what the height of the window is. Now, it's very easy to do that with JavaScript. We'll set up a variable called window height, and we use the string to get a bit of jQuery, and then we use the window to refer to the actual window, so the browser window. And we can use the height command to work out the height of that window. So let's just use an alert to see what that gives us. 66. So my browser window here is 626 pixels high. Now let's get the height of the menu bar. So this time we just select menu bar and we use height again, and let's have a quick look at what that is. Yikes. Sorry, that's because I've forgotten my brackets. Great, 40 pixels. Makes a lot more sense. Okay, so now we just want to set the height of the code container class to be equal to, in fact, let's create a new variable, code container height, and that's going to be equal to window height minus menu bar height. So we want to set the height to code container height, and we're going to need to add on pixels there because we need to specify the units of our height. Okay, great. You can see that works really nicely. It gives us the exact height that we want. Fantastic. Okay, so now we've got our code container. We're going to need to use a text area to put our code in. Let's just put some example code inside our text area for the moment. See how that looks. Okay, there it is. So let's style that a little bit. So code container text area. Let's set the width and the height to 100%. Great. And let's deal with the border. We'll set all the borders to none, but the right border can be 1px solid grey. Okay, that looks nice. And then we'll have all of those bits of code will work quite nicely. Great. Okay. So there's our example code. Do we want to style that at all? I think maybe we could use a fixed width font would be nice. So let's have a font family of just a basic fixed width font is monotype. When you're coding, it's always nice to have a fixed width font, and then you can just see your code much easier. And maybe make it a little bit larger. Let's go for 120%, see how that looks. A little too large. A little too small. I think that's nice. And maybe a little bit of padding. Maybe a touch more. Okay, great. The only other thing that we need is something telling us that this is the HTML bit. So I'm going to pop that here. We'll have a div tag with a class of code label and content of HTML. So if we have a look at that there, that's not exactly what we want. In fact, that does remind me that we could do with getting rid of our background blue. So we don't need that anymore either. Okay, but we want to put the HTML label over here. So we want to essentially float it on the right. So sorry, what was our class? Code label. Now we could try a float right there, but I'm not entirely happy with that, because then we'll have lots of floats all over the place, these floating lefts and that floating right. It would work fine, but I'm going to use a position instead. So I'm going to use an absolute positioning. Remember, absolute positioning takes it out of the flow of the page. So it will be positioned on top of other elements. There we go. And we'll set our margins. So we want it to be on the right. So we'll set a right margin of 10 pixels and a top margin of 10 pixels as well. Okay, that's great. Notice though that it's positioning it relative to the browser window. We want it to position it relative to our div. So if you remember, the way to do that is to give the container div, that is the code container in this case, a relative position. So if we change this to position relative, there we go. So that looks pretty nice. You can style that a little bit if you like, so we don't confuse it with the actual code there, but I'm going to leave it as it is because I think it looks perfectly pleasant. So there we've got our HTML. Now let's copy that div to make two more divs, which are going to be the CSS container and the JavaScript container. So we'll change the labels. And initially we don't want those to appear, so I'm going to add some CSS to simply set the display to none. And then, oops, something's gone wrong there, probably because I used small c's. Let's fix that. And JS container. Great. So we're back to how we were before, and we can bring the CSS and JS in later on. So our last one is going to be our result container. The label is going to be result, but this one, instead of a text area, it's going to have an iframe. And it's the iframe that we're going to put the result into. Now we need to sort that out a little bit because it's not looking great. We're only going to have a single iframe, so let's just refer to it as an iframe. So let's set the height to 100% first of all, so that'll stretch it all the way down, and let's move it slightly to the right. Give it a margin of 10 pixels on the left, maybe a touch more to give it a kind of centered feel to it. Great. And I'm actually going to remove the border completely. You might rather keep in a border so that you can see what's going on, but I quite like the seamless look of having it completely melted into the page. Okay. So this is as far as I would hope you could get on your own, because we've now just created the look of the page. We've got our text areas and we've got our result iframe over here. So let's start by doing some toggling and making sure that when we click the CSS button over here, the CSS div appears. So first of all, we're going to want to give these LIs a class. We could possibly do without it, because they are the only LIs, but I think it's probably best to give them a class so that we can refer to them unambiguously. So, toggle. So what happens then when we click our toggle? Let's bring in a function. So first of all, let's sort out the styling of the actual buttons themselves. So we want them to go darker when they're clicked. So let's create a separate class for when they're selected. And initially we want HTML and the result to be selected. So we'll give them the class to start off with. And simply enough, we can just let the background color be grey. There we go. We have a slight issue there. Let's see if we can sort that out. Okay, let's just make sure. Get that exactly right. Nice. Okay, great. So we've lost our extra bit of padding there. So going back to our JavaScript code, there's a new function that I'm going to teach you called toggle class. So when we've clicked on one of these, what we want to do is toggle whether or not the class of selected is applied to them. So if the selected class is applied, we want to de-apply it. And if it isn't applied, we want to apply it. So let's say how we do that. We're going to use the this command to select the particular li item that was clicked. And that's the toggle class command. And whoops, we want to toggle the class of selected. So that does a really nice job of bringing in whether or not the buttons have been selected and clicked. Fantastic. Right. Now we can also use a toggle command to toggle whether or not the larger divs are displaying. So let's see how we might do that. We need to work out which div to make appear or disappear depending on which button is clicked. So we're going to need to know which button is clicked. What we could do actually, I was thinking of giving these an ID, but quite cleverly, because the content of the actual LIs themselves, so HTML, CSS, JS, and result, if we change the IDs of the containers to be the same case as the actual content of the LIs, then we can create a variable, let's say new div. No, I don't like new div. Let's call it active div. So this is the div that we're working with at the moment, is going to be this dot HTML. And let's just check that that works. So alert active div. So when I click on JS, then it alerts JS. Click on CSS, it alerts CSS, etc. Okay. Let's not forget to capitalize the names of the divs up there. Great. So we can now toggle the div according to its ID. So let's get, for example, let's say we were going to click on HTML. Then we would want to toggle the HTML code container. So that would be HTML container. Like that. Toggle. And this toggle function again just makes it appear or disappear as necessary. So now if I click on HTML, I get that pop-up and HTML disappears. Let's just get rid of the alert command, we don't need that anymore. So HTML now appears and disappears very happily. That's great, but of course it's not going to be HTML every time, because at the moment it's always HTML that we're toggling. But what we can do is replace HTML with the variable active div, because that will be the text of the actual li itself. And so if I click on result, then this will select the result container. So now, if I click on result, that disappears or reappears. I can do the same with JS, CSS, etc., etc. Now you're noticing, of course, that our problem is the width stays at 50%, and we don't want that. We need to make the width, if all four of them are going to appear, we need to have the width as being 25%. So it's important that we know how many divs are currently active and then set their widths accordingly. Fortunately, there's a great jQuery function called filter that we can use to do this. So let's show you how it works. Let's have a variable called showing divs. And what we're going to do, we're going to loop through all of the divs with a class of code container. So code container. And we're going to filter them according to a particular function. And that function is going to return if the CSS of that particular div has a display value of none or not. So we want to know whether or not the display value is none or something else, i.e. showing or not showing. So we use this again, and CSS display none. Oh. CSS display, and we want to know whether or not that is equal to none. Great, so this little function will return true if the display of this particular div is not equal to none. So essentially it will return true if this div is displaying, is showing, which is exactly what we want. Okay, great. The last thing we need to do is set our function to work out the length of that little array that this is going to create. And essentially this will then give us the number of active divs, or the displaying divs, out of all of the code container divs. So it's quite a useful little function, useful little trick. Let's just check that it's working. So if I do that, we get 3, brilliant. If I do that, we get 4, etc. Fantastic. So we've got our showing divs. So now we just need to calculate the width that we need depending on how many divs are showing. So let's create a variable, we'll call it width. That's going to be equal to 100 for 100% divided by the number of showing divs. So if showing divs is 2, then we want 50% each. If it's 3, we want 33 1/3% each. And if it's 4, then we want 25% each. And then all we need to do is set our code containers to have a width of width plus %. Great, see how that works. Excellent, so we'll bring in JavaScript. Great, so this is working really well. You can see there's one problem there. We're not getting the borders showing of the CSS boxes. This is because we've got issues with overlapping here caused by padding and widths going to over 100% of the width. Now there's a nice easy way to fix that, and that is to use the box sizing attribute and set it equal to border box. Just see what effect that has. Everything displays now really nicely. What that essentially does is it includes the border in the width of the box and the padding as well. So you don't get these problems of padding adding to the width of an already 100% wide element. So that can be a really useful trick if you find yourself running into this problem. Okay, so if we now have a look, we're pretty close. We've got our elements updating and toggling very nicely. We can update the example code in each of those three. So the one thing that we need to do is actually make the code player work. We need to run the code in the iframe. So we're going to do that when the run button is clicked. Our run button had an ID of run button, very sensible. So let's select that and run a function when it's clicked. Okay, so what we're going to want to do when the run button is clicked is fill the iframe contents with the values of, let's start for the moment with HTML and CSS, and we'll worry about the JavaScript later. Now, this is something that you haven't seen before, but it's reasonably straightforward. We select the iframe, as we normally would, and then we use the contents function, like that, to find or to search within the contents of the iframe. And then we use the find function to find the tag with the value of HTML. And then we want to set the HTML of that tag. For now, let's just do a test. Let's do one step at a time and change the value of the HTML in the HTML tag in the contents of the iframe to test. Let's just see if that works. Great. Okay, so we've changed the contents of our iframe. Obviously, we don't generally want to change them to test. We want to change them to whatever is in the HTML section of the divs. So let's set the text area for this one to have an ID of HTML code. While we're here, we'll do CSS code as well and JavaScript code. Great, and then instead of test, we want to have the HTML code .val. Great, okay, let's run that. Brilliant. So we're displaying the example code in our iframe. Nice. Now we need to get the CSS in there as well. So that's reasonably straightforward. All we do is open a script tag in the HTML, and then we're going to add our CSS to that. So our CSS has an ID of CSS code .val. So I'm going to open a style tag. There we go. Notice I'm using single quotes for my style tag so that it doesn't get confused with the double quotes that we're using to identify our elements. So after the style tag, I want to put the contents of the CSS code text area. Val there, and then I want to end the style tag, and then I want to put the HTML. So just before we test that out, let's just change the CSS code to something that will actually make a difference. So I'm going to set the background of the HTML, the background color, to blue. Okay, see how that works? That looks great. Okay, so we've got our HTML in there, we've got our styles in there. The only thing that we need to do now is our JavaScript. Now, there are various issues with running JavaScript that users are allowed to enter. And I'm not going to go into those issues now. They're pretty complicated. Generally, they're big security issues. So you don't want to just allow users to run arbitrary JavaScript on your site, because they, in theory, then can access some files and access scripts on your server. So you don't want to allow that. But for this, because we're just running it offline, we'll do it in a very simple way. And you can check out the security implications yourself. I won't go into those here. So there's a very simple way to evaluate JavaScript. And again, it's a bit of a dangerous function, but we'll deal with it for now because we're just running this offline. And simply, there's a command called eval. And so if I want to evaluate the JavaScript in the JS code text area, I just select JS code.val, put that inside my eval statement, and let's change the JavaScript code to something that will actually work. Like that. Now if we run that, that runs the JavaScript as well. Brilliant. Now, one slight thing that we just need to finish off to make the whole thing work nicely is that at the moment, the JavaScript is not actually being run in the iframe. So if I do an alert, that's fine because we don't notice which frame the alert's being done in. But if I tried to run something which required access to the HTML or the CSS which is contained within the iframe, then that's not going to work. So I need to actually run the JavaScript in the iframe. And to do that, I need to actually use good old JavaScript to select my iframe. So I'm going to need an ID for the iframe. We'll call it result frame. And then we use document.getElements by ID. Remember that? Result frame. We use a function called content window to access the content of the iframe. And then we do our eval within the content window. And now we can just test that out. So we still get our nice JavaScript alert. Let's just make sure that that is happening inside the window. How can we do that? Well, let's just run some JavaScript which will only work within the window. So let's have a div with an ID of test. Okay, so that's going to be our example code over here. And then we're going to use our JavaScript to set the HTML of that test div to be something, and then we'll know that it's working within that iframe. So we'll have document.getElement by ID test. Remember how to do this? In our HTML, remember that, equals, it's working. Okay, let's take a look. Run, it's working. Fantastic. So we've got HTML being put into this iframe. We've got CSS being applied to that HTML. And then we've got the JavaScript actually running on that HTML. So fantastic. If you've managed to recreate this yourself, then congratulations. Not an easy website at all. If you've played around with it and you've created something that looks a bit different or works in a slightly different way, then that's great. Please upload it to the servers and show us a link in the forum so we can take a look. Please do, however, remove the eval option from the JavaScript, because you are putting yourself a little bit in danger and allowing people to potentially access your server. So if you're going to upload it somewhere, remove the eval so it's only the HTML and the CSS that's working, not the JavaScript.